Alrighty. So, welcome to the Japan Energy Podcast.
Thank you.
Lovely to have you on, Yuri.
Thank you very much.
So, our guest today is Yuri Humber. He's the president of Yuri Group, so founded after nearly a decade with Bloomberg. And your company is providing a range of intelligence products for investors and energy professionals. So, Japan Energy, it's probably the flagship weekly production, which covers essentially all of the news that matters in energy. But you and your team are providing specialist research projects and products, reports for different customers, both in Japan or companies interested in the Japan market, and also some different researchers as well. I think one of my favorites are the good reports that you guys put together, where you're really covering essentially innovation at that intersection, at the crossroads of the green and the digital transformation. So, just another little bit of background. I know that you're fully trilingual, background in life split between Russia, England, and Japan. And we've spoken many times about energy and entrepreneurship, usually over a couple of craft beers. So thanks for coming in, and just water at the moment. Apologies for that. But welcome to the podcast and thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. That's a very kind introduction. And I'm really excited to be here. No need for craft beer to get me going. I think, yeah, as you said, the business, essentially, even though energy is the majority of our business, but we, as you mentioned, we do other things too. I would say it isn't just information. People think, information, well, isn't that basically what a media does? We are not there to provide information per se. We're there to provide the right kind of intelligence that will allow companies or public entities to make decisions. Because ultimately, the information that we put together includes also context and analysis. Because the end product has to be that someone has to make a decision and it leads to an actual new project getting funded or a new initiative starting and so on. If it's too conceptual, I think it's a great discussion. It's obviously a starting point, but from our business point of view, it's not where we are. We are in the practical application space. So maybe our perspective is a little bit different from some of the research institutes or think tanks, which I have a lot of respect for. But certainly what we try and provide is either whether it is for an investor or for an energy company or for an embassy, it's that sort of practical insight that will allow them to make the next few steps.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I know the analysis pieces every week from your team and from guest writers are always really insightful. And I think that leads well into the conversation which we're looking at having today, which is around innovation in Japan. So, bridging that gap between concept, a great idea, something that works in the lab, to something that is commercially viable and works in the real world. So, I guess the opening question for you is, we know Japan innovates, but does it commercialize?
So, of course, the answer to both has to be yes and yes, if we're going to be completely honest. But if you break it down to what we care about, specifically topic matter, at least for today, energy, I think the answer is a little different. Japan is a fantastic innovator, and in fact, most people, until very recently, I think, had this perception of Japan as some kind of, stuck in the mud, sort of has been, trailing behind China in many ways. And that was unfair. And still, I think the story is changing now. The narrative is changing, and the world is waking up to the fact that Japan continues to be a fantastic innovator. In fact, it is one of the world's top R&D investors as a country, right? So 3.7% of Japan's GDP gets put into research and development, which is really one of the world's top. But what I think why the no is I think on the commercialization side, for sure we've had some big commercialization stories, like the LNG sector wouldn't be what it is today without Japan. The solar sector wouldn't be where it is today without Japan. But maybe in the last couple of decades, I feel like the that innovation spirit or innovation material hasn't actually translated into commercialization. And I think that has created a real issue because, look, Japan is a country that prides itself on manufacturing, on monozukuri, and that's fantastic. But the bedrock of any economy, Japan's included, is the energy sector. You have to be able to power your manufacturing, or today AI and so forth. Japan has built up a huge reliance on imported energy. Now, in a world where things work and everything's on time and there are no huge geopolitical issues, that's fine. But I think, this year has been a pretty good
Yeah.
showcase where that isn't the case. It's not like Japan's sort of energy establishment wasn't aware of it. There
Yeah.
were literally plans in place
Mm,
for what would happen. And I think that Japan has acted fantastically quickly as a
mm,
government and as a corporate sector to realign itself to other suppliers and so forth. But look, we had the real blockage that continues around the Strait of Hormuz.
mm,
We have China that has literally stopped the exports of key rare earths
mm-hmm,
materials to Japan because of geopolitics. There will be other crises for sure.
mm,
There have been near misses, if you like, around the COVID pandemic when energy
mm-hmm,
systems were broken up. That with so much disruption, you would think that this is really a weak point that is well understood enough and creates a sense of urgency, not just
mm,
in the government, but among the companies to go out there and say, we need to put in different new technology solutions and other solutions. Where I struggle here is that I look at a lot of the energy companies in Japan, both in the oil and gas sector and the power sector and so on. And I see them putting in roughly the same amount of money as their global peers
mm-hmm,
into this space. But is there anything actually that's coming in near term that will move the needle? That's
mm,
where I think there is a real issue that the companies are pursuing lots and lots of little small scale bets,
mm-hmm,
but they're not actually putting together the frameworks and as the favorite phrase is nowadays, the supply chains that will deliver something soon. Now, I know that people will point to a few examples here and there and we'll come to them, but I think that this is really a structural issue. Innovation in the energy sector in Japan has come historically through this vaunted collaboration between the state,
mm-hmm,
the companies, and the academia. That's been fantastic for creating new technologies for testing, demonstration technologies for pilot plants, and so on. But because so much of the innovation is supported by the state, both in terms of money and in terms of direction, I think it's created a kind of safety net for the companies.
mm,
They've lost some of that risk appetite
mm-hmm,
to go in and really, put their money where their mouth is. I think there's so much, pardon the word, but there's so much dabbling in
mm,
innovation. There's so much small scale betting placed across so many different technologies that it's really hard to see, too many of the companies really staking their future on this. And, this creates issues beyond just the national level or from the company's level. Let's look at it this way. The valuation of Japanese energy companies is tiny. I
yeah,
mean, these
mm,
are not
mm,
tiny companies. They
no,
have
mm-hmm,
fantastically broad businesses. But do you know that only a single major energy company in Japan has a price to book value above 1?
really,
That means the assets
yeah,
of the company are worth what it is,
yeah,
just 1 to 1. There's only one. And everyone else is worth. In fact, most of the electricity companies are 0.37 to
really,
0.35.
that's not even close.
No. So
Wow,
literally, if
okay,
you break them up,
mm,
you'll get more for it than
yeah,
they are as businesses. And
mm,
that isn't what happens again, looking at the global comparisons. It's not what we see in the US or in Europe.
mm,
These companies are valued by the market.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
And why is that important? Because we're talking about innovation and
mm,
pricing by the market isn't a one for one comparison. But I will say this: when a company wants to go big on a new business to make large investments, it has a few options in terms of raising that capital. One of the options is definitely equity.
mm-hmm,
But if you're worth not that much, then that option is closed down.
yeah,
And we can look at a recent example, fairly recent example of Kansai Electric,
mm-hmm,
right? The biggest Japanese power utility at this moment. It said we're going to lead the revival of nuclear energy in Japan.
yeah,
Fantastic. So you need to build a new nuclear reactor. Great. Where are you going to get the money? We're going to sell some shares and then we'll raise the capital. Turns out that them going to the market tanked their stock price by 50%.
Ouch.
Ouch.
Yeah.
And also didn't raise enough money for them to even begin
Mm,
making the kind of investments that they need in this process.
mm,
So I think that's a real issue.
hmm.
Making M&A, in terms of sort of furthering your investments, a real issue.
Yeah.
And so what else do you have option wise? You have debt,
Hmm.
bank financing, maybe debt.
It's getting more expensive.
Exactly. The Bank of Japan is rising interest
Mm,
rates. I think we're in a slightly different environment from 10 years ago. And what else? Well, again, go back to the government.
mm,
Why don't we have METI or NEDO, all these green innovation funds, etc., pay for it? And I find that that's a little bit of a problem. Not
hmm.
only that sort of over cozy relationship where the risk is taken off the table partly by the government, spreading your bets way too thin. I'll give you
Mm,
a quick example. So Idemitsu is one of Japan's largest oil refining
mm.
companies. It's a big oil major, right? Now, it's actually only worth less than $10 billion. It's about $9 billion, right? Not a perfect comparison, but Exxon is closer to half a trillion,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
Obviously, Idemitsu is much smaller in many ways, but it actually isn't as small as people think. Idemitsu is very comparable to BP or Shell in terms of oil refining. Let's look at what Idemitsu today is looking at in terms of different technologies or innovation. It's investing in biofuel feedstocks. It's investing in solar cells. It's investing in e-fuels. It's
Hmm.
investing in nuclear fusion even.
Hmm.
Actually, a lot of these investments are covered by the state.
Mm.
So that means taxpayer funds are going to make all these little bets. But my question is 10 years from now, is Idemitsu going to be a nuclear fusion company? Is it going to be a solar cell company? And if it's not, is it really a good thing to have such a generalist approach,
Mm.
which is where the risk is taken off the table by the government, rather than have it much more focused, which I
Hmm.
think a lack of funds or a sort of a shorter, sort of more risk appetite would favor.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I know for us as a small business, when we need to make an investment, we need to think it's A or B, not A and B. But
Exactly.
from your observations, essentially, a lot of the large Japanese energy companies, they're going to the roulette table and they're putting $10 on everything
Yeah.
and wondering why they're not getting rich. You might get the little
Mm.
adrenaline hit of getting a little kickback here, but then everything else is written off. Let's take a bit of a step back and let's start with the numbers.
Hmm.
The number that you quoted right at the start, you said 3.7% of Japan's GDP is put into R&D.
Right.
So that's really significant. And yes,
Right.
Japan has long been a manufacturer and exporter of technology, energy technologies, and otherwise.
Right.
Um, but when you're looking at, say, the output of what you would expect for that 3.7% of GDP, that seems to be understated in the last couple of decades. And you cited maybe some potentially over-reliance on the public-private model, on public money, maybe a large contributing factor. Do you mind expanding a little bit more on this and maybe give a quick overview on kind of the main public funding vehicles, so maybe like
Mm.
the Green Innovation Fund or long-term decarbonization auction, etc. And what's your take on the impact that that has on R&D and innovation?
Japanese companies certainly do care about innovation, certainly put in the resources, the people, the money, but they also like to do things as a consortium,
Mm,
right? And that often involves rival companies all clubbing together, working with the government, working with a government fund or an entity like NEDO, which is essentially funneling, METI money, government money
hmm.
into new projects. What that does is create sort of a broader effect where a lot of buy-in is there from the start. That's great. But it also means that, let's say you pick a direction, you say, we want to get into hydrogen, then you have everybody really taking a little bit piece of the pie. Okay, this company will investigate hydrogen in this form, and this
Hmm.
company will
Hmm.
investigate hydrogen in another form. And essentially you're covering so many different angles because in an academic exercise, that's exactly the right approach.
Mm,
But in a commercial exercise, I think you have to, even from the early stage, you have to say, but what are we bringing to the market? What's actually going to be the marketable product that we can sell, that our
hmm.
clients will pay for? And with the sort of the Japanese, public private collaboration model, I think it's a great way of going, across, as you say, the roulette table and covering all the bases. But it also assumes that there is always going to be this fantastic amount of money to share between
Mm,
everybody, and we all try it out. And I think as the state of public finances in Japan changes, I think we have to consider that maybe there's going to be less money in the pot going forward.
mm,
And so instead of, making ever smaller bets across so many
mm.
factors, I think we have to get a little bit more competitive. Maybe we don't need all the energy companies going into all the fields all at the same time. If Idemitsu is going to go big on e-fuels, do we also need Enios to go big on e-fuels? And do we also need the other
Sure, sure.
upstream companies
Yeah.
to do the same? I think that's the issue. And so what we have is when we create these green innovation funds and other models, and most recently the long-term decarbonized power sources
Yep.
auction, the LTDA. So we create a tool that is supposed to be more narrowly focused on channeling certain kind of innovation. But
Hmm.
what happens over time, because of that embedded culture of collegiate, collaborative, broad industry support model, is that it ends up being generalist. The LTDA was brought in initially to do what? To support the building of new capacity for a few sectors,
Yes.
right? And we saw that from round one. Who were
Hmm.
who were the big ones?
Energy storage was the big
Absolutely.
headline. Yeah.
Energy storage was the big one. There was a carve out for LNG. We always knew that that was going
Yep.
to be supported. Fine. Um, but as you've gone through the rounds, we suddenly have quite a lot of allocation towards nuclear.
Hmm.
Okay,
Hmm.
okay, maybe necessary, but you also have allocation to still ongoing allocation towards batteries. You also now have an increasing cap on hydrogen and ammonia.
Mm.
There is talk about bringing in offshore wind into the LTDA to support the earlier
The
project of
round two and round three
round
bids,
three,
right?
right?
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
what are we actually achieving at and the LNG that sort of will only do it for a little bit has been extended.
Sure.
So LTDA has become a magic wand for every single sector.
Mm, mm,
And in
mm.
that sense, we're moving away from selection,
Yeah.
from focus on particular sectors and really needling that support into something that we need,
Mm.
to going covering everything. And that's sort of maybe a slightly different way of measuring innovation. Japan could do better instead of going too broad.
It's always, yeah, simply, it's easier to spend someone else's money than it is your own.
Absolutely.
I see actually you mentioned as well the consortiums. One company that we know Obayashi Group, so one of Japan's largest general contractors. They're the company that constructed the Skytree, but they also have quite a significant green energy business. And some of that business, they've put their own capital, their own risk capital, their own investments. But a lot of that has been overseas, where they haven't had this, say, state-backed support. They've invested quite heavily into clean energy generation in New Zealand. So they invested early, and now that's over 100 megawatts of operating capacity. They've also invested into Helicon Power through a joint venture there for geothermal to hydrogen. Most of that was their own money. But earlier this year, they announced the Japan-New Zealand hydrogen corridor. This is also definitely very much a consortium. So that's with, I believe it was Mitsui OSK, Kawasaki Heavy, Chiyoda, are all involved. And if you put the lens onto the domestic business, essentially they're looking at the hydrogen, the geothermal R&D, looking at the downstream infrastructure in Japan, the refueling stations. This all leans very, very heavily on the Green Innovation Fund, on NIDO money. So it's their own capital overseas, but then really that public-private model domestically. So,
Absolutely. I think that's a perfect example. I think there's plenty of companies that will have almost a very similar story. You'll have some incredible innovation by MHI in terms of
mhm.
hydrogen in Utah, but here, please cover our, majority of our hydrogen R&D testing. Mitsui will have spent, quite a lot of its capital to go big on, new fuels, methanol, etc. Elsewhere, domestically, we need an e-fuel subsidy program.
Mm,
I think there is, I don't know, if that's the companies just sort of essentially gaming the system, if they can get it, then why not? If it's the government sort of offering that support because it wants to be leading that, our research came up recently is that sort of almost the entirety of Enios's recent e-fuel investment came from Neto.
Mm,
And to me, that sounds strange. Why do you, first of all, why would you like the government to be backing the entirety of your R&D in a particular field? Because that certainly locks you into a lot of obligations,
100%.
right? The
Yeah.
government does have an agenda,
Yeah.
and it certainly is going to restrict your profit. I mean, we were talking about LTDA just a moment earlier.
Perfect. Yeah.
Perfect example. So
Mm,
everyone's being herded into LDA, not just even herded, they're actually actively saying, please give us
yeah.
LTDA so we
Hmm.
can be involved. But that means your profit is going to be capped.
We speak to say that the multinational infrastructure funds and looking at LTDA, and they look at it and go, no thanks. Well, why? It's like, yeah, okay, yes, the LTDA covers a lot of your capex, and so it de-risks at the start. But then when you go to market, 90% of your profits get funneled back to the government. And I go, we got people to pay.
Absolutely.
That's not going to work for us.
Absolutely.
So it says something about the risk appetite
Yeah.
of Japanese companies, and I think there's always been that image that Japan has been somewhat risk averse. They can be a bit slow to start. I think one of the phrases you used earlier was a lack of a sense of urgency,
Yep.
which becomes really front and center in this kind of questions around energy security and geopolitical risk at the moment. So with the government doing a lot of heavy lifting, with companies kind of hedging across a lot of different technologies, are you seeing this dull companies' commercial instinct? And are you seeing companies putting R&D money down R&D pathways without a clear roadmap to commercial viability and scalability?
I think the answer has to be yes. Maybe some of the big companies involved will listen to this and say, "Oh, you just don't know our big, great plans." And
Two foreigners in
you know,
Japan talking
yeah,
about
yeah,
Japan energy,
exactly,
right?
exactly. They don't see the long road. I still would like, I'll give some concrete examples. I mentioned Idemitsu earlier, and so
Mm,
this is not to pick on Idemitsu. In
sure.
many ways, very recently they won 3 billion yen in funding from JAXA, the space agency,
Hmm.
to develop high efficiency, lightweight, next generation solar cells
Okay.
for satellites. And supposedly this is also partly to cover the development of mass production technologies. Now, this is relatively near term because the first pilot plant, again, I emphasize pilot because I wonder how far it will go beyond that,
Sure.
will begin next year. But my question is this: so if Idemitsu is really a specialist in this field, and he may well have some specialists who are great in lightweight solar cells, why have they not made this business significant
Mm, mm,
already? Or if they're developing solar cells for space, which seems to be quite a niche, what's the plan with this technology going forward?
sure.
Beyond, very visionary. Like, I mean, a concrete plan. Where are you going to be selling these radio
Mm,
active protected solar cells in the field? And is this a really scalable business for you?
hmm,
With the
hmm.
kind of company that you are, size of company, is this going to move the needle for you?
Yeah.
Are you going to grow a significant business in lightweight solar cells?
Hmm.
If so, fantastic, let's see it. But at this moment, given the histories, I just see it as another bet that is, well, it's not even a bet because a bet sort of involves risk. Here, you're essentially getting the money covered to set up a production that Jackson needs.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Who's going to be your next customer? Is this market really large enough for you as Inimitsu?
It's a really good example, and when you say energy companies they can't do everything. You look at some of the global energy majors, and in the last couple of years, BP, Shell, Total, they've all done a 180 on a lot of their clean energy initiatives, right? And
Right?
what they've gone and focused on, this is the core business. This
Mm-hmm.
is what they need, and they look at shareholder pressure and government pressure, and this is where they need to focus. It seems like in Idemitsu example that you've given, it seems to align interestingly with, say, the government's GX policy, which is, of course, designed to foster Japanese innovation in areas where they're not, say, priced out of the market by
Mm-hmm.
China or behind the technology curve. So it is necessary to develop new technologies, new solutions, But I think offline, I think a phrase that you mentioned to me was that sometimes you have a look at these projects and you see them creating supply,
Hmm.
but it's not necessarily creating demand. And how many satellites are we going to be sending up to be able to make economies of scale work for this? And if the answer is we don't, where else is that technology applicable? Is this a typical pattern that you see?
I don't know if there is an innovation that's too early per se. It's about,
Mm,
is your commercialization good enough?
sure.
And I think you're absolutely right. You have a situation where the public-private model, uh, METI, with a lot of very smart people there, they are very good at creating the supply side. So
Yeah.
what is that? That's the technology.
Mm-hmm.
That's the technology. That's some of the technical engineering solutions. But where is, let's say, the hydrogen economy?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we've been talking about the hydrogen economy for a while. The first hydrogen white paper Japan published ahead of everyone else was, I think, 2017.
Mm-hmm.
The national strategies hydrogen economy, you have almost weekly, in our Japan Energy reports, you'll see almost weekly news of how Kawasaki has created a new engine that runs on
Mm-hmm.
hydrogen.
Mm-hmm.
You'll see, someone else has created a new boiler or an application that burns ammonia, no CO2 released, etc., etc. So you have all of these supply side tools in place,
Mm.
but you don't really see as many companies saying, and we're now going to put that, boiler in place, or we're going to use this engine, or, yes, we'll have a little tugboat that runs on a dual hydrogen engine,
Great.
but I don't see right, right. But what are your plans for a whole fleet of hydrogen? And
Yeah.
that's where the usual problem comes in, where the clients say, well, this is too expensive.
Yeah.
We don't want to pay for it. And so, if you don't have something or someone or an entity that says, we will bridge the gap between innovation, the
Mm-hmm.
technology,
Mm-hmm.
and the commercialization
Yeah.
by creating the market, then you will always have, as you said, innovation that's counted as too early.
It's interesting, and maybe you need to take a step back and go, you don't always need to invent. Inventions are great. That's obviously
Mm,
moving technology forward, right? Without that, then we stagnate. But Japan's been a fantastic innovator, an improver, a perfecter of
yep.
technologies, right? Historically, look at some of the wins in the automotive industry, in the electronics industry, the whiskey industry,
Hmm.
right?
Yep. Yeah.
Japan is fantastic
Yep.
at taking something that they didn't invent. There's one company which the name is Anexia.
Hmm.
It's fully owned by Sumitomo.
Hmm.
So huge Japanese trading house, one of the largest. And Sumitomo, they have of course the summer energy business, and they have the Sumitomo DX Center. They've established Anexia as a fully owned subsidiary that also self-governs, so it can move quickly and
Hmm.
make decisions quite
Hmm.
fast. Now, what Anexia is doing is it's forecasting renewable generation, solar, wind, and it's optimizing your supply and demand for traders. So it's an optimizer.
Hmm.
I was in eWorld in Germany earlier this year. There's a ton of these companies in
Hmm.
Europe, but here we already have demand.
Hmm.
This is a growing area in Japan where you have
Hmm.
more renewables coming
Hmm.
in. We're trying to balance that with energy storage, and
Hmm.
Japan is making a made for Japan optimizer. And it's not just for the Japan domestic market. Summer energy in Europe already aggregates well over a gigawatt of clean power.
Hmm.
It's definitely going over there. So I think more stories like this, where Japanese companies are having a look and going, here's demand, here's growth, we can innovate, we can improve on what's out there.
Hmm.
I think that's where I'd like to see a little bit more.
Absolutely. I think it's an, pardon the phrase, but it's an unsexy case, but it's a real business case,
Mm,
and whereas what would be traditionally seen as the, again, pardon the phrase, sexy case in Japan, why don't we create, e-fuels that we can then
mm.
demonstrate at the World Expo in Osaka? How much are you going to create? You know, 1 ton a day. It's enough to power the buses that go to the expo. Or, we for the Olympics, we'll
Yeah,
create hydrogen
I
vehicles,
remember
you
that.
know.
Yes.
Um, I think that it's again, this is not to be condescending or arrogant, but it's almost cute. You're
Mm,
creating something that is small but you're not looking at whether or how to take on the heavy lifting of commercializing it.
Yeah.
And so if you are concerned about the commercialization of a new technology that you think is too early,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
then, as you say, why not flip it around and say, what are the things that we can do now or in the near term, which may or may not require a lot of R&D, and get it out there. I'm pretty sure the Jackson needs these solar cells pretty soon.
Sure.
That's why the pilot plant is going to start next year.
Mm.
And so that's fantastic. There's one headache, one major headache removed
Mm.
from Idemitsu's plate, because they don't have to think about whether these solar cells will sell or not. They will already
Mm.
have a client. But let's see a little bit more of that in the mass production, sectors,
Yeah.
because what I see quite often is, innovation and pilot stage and so on stretched over years and years and years.
Mm.
We're talking about e-fuels.
The government support only goes so far, and the
Right.
government will naturally be selective over what technologies they wish to support and subsidize,
Yep.
etc. So, a lot of the innovation is going to have to come from another source, a different source of capital. So, let's look a bit more on the private sector.
Hmm.
So money coming in for private R&D. Typically, we're going to be looking at venture capital, corporates or corporate venture capital.
Hmm.
Now, on the VC side, I understand that in Japan, essentially, say pure VC is still it's still nascent. It's still relatively small,
Very small.
right? We're seeing fund sizes 15 to 50 million US dollars, right? So they can make either lots of little bets or a couple of reasonable bets, but it's nowhere near the scale that you see in US or some other markets. I do tend to see a bit more, say Japan having a leaning a bit more on CVC
Hmm.
and corporate investments, in lieu of having a very mature VC market. How do you see the CVC space in energy in Japan? Are you seeing that quite accurately looking at allocating strategic capital into commercially viable growth areas, or are you seeing this as, say, a little bit of compliance capital focused on what the government would like to develop?
We have a team that's sort of outside Japan Energy that looks at
Mm.
the startup sector in Japan, the VCs, CVCs, and the whole ecosystem.
Mm.
We've done, you mentioned the good reports. We've also done a couple of sort of deep dives for um, clients like the European Union and so on
Hmm.
on Japan's energy startup, sorry, ecosystem. So first of all, I think that you're absolutely right. In Japan, it's really not about VCs, it's CVCs.
Mm.
It's big corporates aware that they need to invest in innovation, concerned maybe that some of that innovation is becoming a little stagnant in-house, or
Mm.
not because of, again, a lack of trying, but maybe because of too much bureaucracy, silos, and so on. But being aware of the problem is great, because it means that they say, we are aware of the constraints. What we're going to do is allocate capital outside of our government entity or corporate
Hmm.
entity,
Hmm.
and that entity will pursue innovation. So that could be an allocation into a startup or
Yep.
a fund that then incubates
Hmm.
startups and so on. So that part is great. But here are a few, I think, limitations that we're running into.
Mm.
One, as you mentioned, is the ticket size. The
Hmm.
ticket size is so small. Two, it's the fact that the Japanese CVC model is surprisingly actually quite good at connecting with startups initially and saying, yes, look, this is an interesting technology. Let's work on it together. Being a CVC, you're not really in it for the startup. You're in it in terms of potentially getting that technology to work
Yes.
in-house for your company, for your business. And there, I think we have a little bit of a conflict of, not a conflict of interest, but like a misalignment. One of the top startups in the Japan energy space of recent years is Tsubame BHP.
Mm.
It's an
Yep.
ammonia catalyst, and it's a very interesting company. Again, lots of smart people got together and developed so many of the components you need for ammonia production. Can be blue, can be green. They've been working with a Japanese corporate to create a blue ammonia plant in Japan. Now, as you know, blue ammonia requires actual natural gas, which
Hmm.
Japan doesn't have a lot of. So The size of the blue ammonia plant in Japan is quite small.
Sure.
We're talking about, again, 500 tons. It's really nothing. It's a
Mm-hmm.
pilot.
Mm-hmm.
And it's taken years to just go there, get to that stage where this pilot is, running. What they need to be doing is going big because they're a startup. They're supposed
Sure.
to be growing fast. If that's not the startup model, then you're really not what we would think of as a fast growing startup business.
Mm.
And they're not finding those opportunities here. I think what's surprising to me is then you had a Brazilian company come over to Japan and
Mm.
say, okay, we like what you do. How about we build a 20,000 ton plant back in Brazil? Another example here is obviously TEPCO has a ton of complications about it, as you know, because it's
Sure.
having to recover
The
money to
last
pay
15
for.
years
Yeah,
have been tough.
exactly.
Yeah.
But at some point, somebody within TEPCO said, we should create a CVC
Mm-hmm.
and we should find interesting technologies that would help us to improve our own business. So they created the CVC, and having talked to the one of the people that was running it, I understand that they made quite a lot of investments and didn't even really think about whether this would be a profit or not. So this wasn't a financial investment. This
Okay.
is very much an investment for the technology.
Right.
So we'll forget the fact that most of them lost a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
So what did they gain? And this is the problem, that you had a very large, very you know, bureaucratic if you want to be negative, or organized if you want to be positive,
Mm-hmm.
entity in Japan that's very good at running the power grid in the TEPCO area, right?
Yep.
It's definitely seen as one of the top ones in this sector. The engineers on the TEPCO side were found it difficult to communicate with the startups or the technologists in these startups,
I can imagine.
right? So there's all sorts of
Yeah.
issues. There's the entity, the
Yeah.
size of the entity. You've got a
Sure.
team of whatever 20 people
Yeah.
talking to one or two people in a
Mm.
startup. You have the language barrier, you have the age barrier
Sure.
oftentimes. And then in essentially it led to, what I understand, a lot of frustrations and
Mm.
miscommunications, and sort of a lack of trust, where the
Mm-hmm.
TEPCO engineer said, we don't really think we can work with these guys. They need to get more
They
mature, if
don't
you
follow the
like,
rules.
right? They need to be a bit more, advanced in their technology.
Yeah.
But, you're talking to a startup. This
Yeah.
startup may have created this technology in the last 6 months.
Sure.
They have perhaps not quite got to the same level of documentation or explanations as you would expect from a large mature corporate, but that's the whole point.
Yeah.
If you can't make it work, then you can't bring in the innovation into your system. So in the end, what happened with the TEPCO CVC, from what I understand, is that they had lost a lot of money, they didn't get the technology,
Mm.
and so what they did was they simply shrunk the pot of how
Mm.
much they made available to
Okay.
the CVC arm. And at that amount of money, we're talking of 1 million USD, or maybe a little bit more.
Mm.
You're essentially investing in much earlier stage startups.
Yeah.
And if you couldn't make it work with startups that were a little bit more advanced, how would you make it work on a technology transfer level
3
with
guys in a garage.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So, and your chances of
Mm.
financial success, as we know, are quite slim.
You're
So,
taking longer shots now. Yeah.
exactly. So that's where I think there's a disconnect.
The TEPCO example is really, really interesting, and it really reminds me of one of our early clients. Actually, we started working with a company called Terawatt Technology.
Mhm.
So next generation battery developer. These are things that make your EV go 100 miles or your computer last for a week. So this is something. There's a lot of horses in this race, right? There's companies, of course, in China, in the US, that are chasing this type of game-changing technology, and there's also batteries are not something that only work in a lab. You have to manufacture and deploy at scale very, very rapidly. So the founder of Terra was a smart guy. He's looked and he's got, at the start, he goes, we need big capital. This is not like a software startup. This is not a million here, a million there. We need a large investment, and we also need agility. We need speed, because this is a race. So the IP came from overseas. He's Japanese, but was living overseas. But all of their R&D, their quality testing, their manufacturing is all done here locally in Japan. But he registered the company in California, and their initial investors were Kozla Ventures and Temasek. So they got that agility, and they got decent ticket size that could come in fast. And after some of that technology risk was taken off the table, then you start seeing the Japanese players come in. So you've got DBJ, Impex came in. And once that happened, it's credible. And so then the strategic investors started rolling in. And so the list went on. You've got, Rakuten Capital, Mori Trust, Jera, Qden, and some others have all come in and invested into that technology. So it was very much a global capital first, Japan Inc. capital coming in a bit later.
It's great that the Japanese companies came in. You don't always have to invest early. At the end of the day, as a CVC, I mean, I think most CVCs would say, look, our goal isn't necessarily to make financial profit. It is to identify the right technologies.
Mm,
But I think that your example shows that sometimes you even have an energy startup in Japan, but it doesn't find the right either capital
yeah.
or opportunities to pursue their technologies in Japan. And so that's not all on corporates, for sure. But I think it is a little bit disappointing because we want this innovation to happen here. We don't
Mm,
look, no matter, I won't get into the politics, but if I see sort of Japanese companies investing $550 billion to make America great again, I'd actually like them to invest the same, or at least something close to that, to make Japan great again, if you like. You want to see a lot more of that investment getting here. They are not cash poor companies either. They've got the size and the knowledge. So let's really sort of hone in on the new technologies that either in-house or through startups here.
mm,
Otherwise, these startups will go elsewhere. Another startup in the energy space in Japan is trying to take on the nuclear sector
mm,
challenge. And they're trying to develop a reactor technology that, again, Japan developed when? In the 2000s,
yeah.
ahead of everyone else. Fantastic. Really, really interesting high temperature gas cooled reactors,
Hmm.
right? Very difficult. Not saying it's going to absolutely work, but
Mm,
there was a great challenge that Japan, again, built a test reactor. It works, etc. So what happens next? Well, what happens next is you should be moving towards a larger scale reactor.
yep.
We have. I understand that the issue has been the Fukushima accident and the,
Hmm.
the pause that has taken on the nuclear sector. But now that we're finally talking about a revival of the nuclear sector, where are the new innovative reactors going to be built?
Yeah. I agree, and it's interesting that you mentioned that one. Actually, there's another company which I believe is a technology competitor to the one that you mentioned called Blossom Energy.
Mm-hmm.
So similar type of next generation reactor, but all of their investors so far, it's 100% Japanese,
Mm-hmm.
basically all Japanese VC, and their pilot the demonstration plant is domestically here in Japan. And though they have global ambitions, rather than looking at say going for that next scale in Japan, they have a second business which is basically closer to commercialization. So this is thermal energy storage.
Mm-hmm.
So LDES technology. I think it's one of the only Japanese companies in this particular type, but that's something which can get commercialized and deployed more quickly
Mm-hmm.
in order then to provide the cash flow and the capital to develop the nuclear technology. So
Yeah, fantastic. That's a
hope,
fantastic.
hopefully we see that working, and that can
Yeah.
also be competitive with the company that's taking the US route. Because yeah, I think we're both here in Japan for a long time. We love seeing the success stories in
Mm-hmm.
Japan. We want to see more
Yep.
of them.
Absolutely.
Um, Technology. I think this is such an interesting one. When we look, we touched on this before, that say the NIDO's Green Innovation Fund is really looking at promoting new technologies that Japan can win on, right?
Mm-hmm.
They've had a look and gone PV, wind,
Mm-hmm.
things that Japan has innovated, but then kind of fallen back on. So what are they looking at? Floating wind, perovskites, nuclear fusion, probably the three that I read about more or come front of mind. Are these smart long-term investments?
You mentioned perovskite. Japan is also already producing perovskite. Is it as good as the perovskite in Japan? Not sure. There seems to be that sort of a technical edge that Japan has in
Hmm.
perovskite, and certainly there has been a more of a sort of a secrecy around the development of perovskite
Hmm.
in Japan, exactly because they don't want the technology to leak to China.
For sure.
That's understandable, but perovskite is a good example of a technology that's finally come to the testing and the pilot stage.
Mm.
Plenty of testing and pilot going on. What I'd like to see is the next steps, at least being outlined by companies. And we're not really there right now.
Mm.
So that sort of creates that anxiety, big, at least for me, that makes me think, wait, is it getting pushed back? Are we going to have everyone come back and say, well, we've tested perovskite and there are a number of challenges. So let's just solve those challenges one by one. And it comes back to the sense of urgency. If you
Yeah.
don't have it, every new technology has challenges.
That's why it's
LNG,
a
when
new
it was
technology.
exactly, I think
Yeah.
that we accept that, there are going to be disadvantages with new technologies. I think we understand about the intermittency of solar panels, and yet we still use them.
Yeah.
There's plenty of things that don't work exactly as we'd hope, but
Mm.
over time,
Mm.
the professionalization of an industry, the scale of an industry helps to work through these problems. Semiconductor chips
Mm.
took decades to
Sure.
be perfected to the kind of extreme technology that we have now,
Yeah.
right? So nobody's saying that it has to be perfect. I think we have to have it with with a company with skin in the game.
Yeah.
Somebody has to take the lead on a level that, makes everyone realize that, yes, it's not just the policy side that Japan is serious on. There are companies, there are business leaders that are willing to take big bets on perovskite.
Mm.
When I see that in Japan, then I'll say, absolutely, perovskite is a technology that Japan is going to go big on. Right now, I see a lot of great potential, and I'm
Mm.
very excited about perovskite because I think it's the perfect kind of technology for today's urban societies.
Mm-hmm.
We're
Yeah.
not trying to create an alternative, or if you like, an energy system that's somewhere else that delivers the energy to where we need it.
Yeah.
It's
It's
integrating that.
here, it's local.
So
Yeah.
that, in theory, is great.
Yeah.
But let's move beyond theory.
Perovskites is a really
Yeah.
interesting one though, because you can certainly see the near term opportunity, the
Yep.
need, the demand, and
Yep.
you can see that gap between R&D and actual commercial
Yep.
viability. It's not there yet, but it's certainly closer. It certainly seems more feasible. But I want to touch on, we've spoken quite a bit about the role of capital
Hmm.
in innovation, right? What type of capital? What's the risk? Um, but you also mentioned a couple of things there about, say, the lack of a sense of urgency, or essentially, kicking the can down the road. It becomes, it's a 2040 problem. It's not something that we need to
Yeah.
solve now. I speak to a lot of people in this area, and I speak to innovative people. I speak to engineers. You know what engineers want to do? They want to build cool stuff, and they want to see that stuff built and deployed and used. So not only capital, but talent is a huge, huge
Absolutely.
piece of innovation. And I think you and I both have some stories of people who have broken the Japan, lifetime employment
Hmm.
um, type of mold to pursue real innovation.
I'll start with a very, very basic example, maybe one that's a little more detailed later. Um, I remember only a few years ago where the CEO of Tokyo Gas,
Mm,
obviously a large gas company
hmm.
that's also become quite a significant player in the electricity market in Japan, the CEO said, we have to be involved in new clean energy businesses
Mm,
because we have a lot of new recruits coming into the company. And they're saying, wait, isn't gas a fossil fuel? And aren't we moving towards net zero decarbonization?
yeah.
So doesn't that mean that the future of the company is sort of
Yeah.
up in the air? Well,
Yeah.
if I'm going to work here for 40, 50 years of my life, aren't we supposed to be moving towards some new technologies,
Mm,
and whether that be renewables or something else? And so I remember the CEO saying, look, it's vital for us as a company, not just from a capital allocation or business
mm,
security, but also for talent attraction and talent retention.
yeah.
It's really important for us to go and challenge ourselves with new directions. Sadly, 3 years on, Tokyo Gas has sort of said, maybe we're not actually the best company at getting into renewables. We understand it's important, but let's just focus for gas for now. Not saying that's an entirely wrong decision. Again, they are good at doing what they are
Sure.
doing, which is natural gas. But I do think it shows that maybe some of the people that initially joined Tokyo Gas
Mm,
would have expected something else. And if they don't, Or a company like them, if they don't pursue the directions, then some of this talent is simply going to say, well, I'm going to go to a company that will.
Yeah. I think it's less of a talent attraction issue because I still see large Japan Inc. companies attracting new grads
Mhm.
because of the name, because of the social status,
Right.
right? You see kids going to the best high school to get into the best university so they can get into the best company.
Right.
Now, is the best company defined by the company that's doing the coolest thing that they want to dedicate their life to? No. It's the one that their father would approve of or
Hmm.
their future wife's father would
Hmm.
approve of.
Sure.
So the new grads still join the big companies. It's great to have that on your resume.
Hmm.
If you graduate a top university and you join Mitsubishi, you're credible for life.
Hmm.
And it's not necessarily the older guys who've been in the company for 25, 30 years that are disappearing. But what we are seeing is we're seeing a hollowing out of the middle. We're seeing the high potential, the guys between 30 and 40 years old who've joined, a few years ago. They've been high performers, they've understood the company, they've been sent overseas, they've been involved in some really interesting projects, and then they've had the rug pulled out from under them.
Mm.
They've been brought back and put into a role that they find boring. That project that they dedicated 3 years of their life to is now shelved,
Mm.
collecting dust. And they go, I actually want to do what I want to do.
Hmm.
And so we see those guys leaving, and they're the critical people because they're the people who are going to be the senpai, the big brothers that have enough clout, enough
Mm.
gravitas to
Mm.
influence or push the company forward,
Mm.
but they're also still young and energetic and creative enough.
Mm. Mm.
So you end up with a situation where the company has the older guys who have lost some of that creative edge and the younger guys that don't understand the details yet.
Hmm.
And that hollowing out of the middle, that retention problem, I think is really, really dangerous
Mm.
for Japanese companies in this pursuit of innovation that we're talking about.
Absolutely. I think you've hit the nail on the head. There is going to be a period of time, maybe not now, but let's say in 10, 20 years' time, where these companies will suddenly realize that the ranks that should have got to the senior positions haven't got there.
Yeah.
And then there might be a real instability or a real insecurity about corporate strategy, corporate future, and so on, because of course, you need the management, you need the sober, you do need the cautious approach with management,
Yep.
and capital allocation. I completely agree with that. But you also need that tension with people pushing the envelope and saying, I will make this, my mission to help my company or my team develop this new technology and make a real business out of it.
Let's bring this to a close. So I think we can both agree that Japan is not going to stop innovating. We're not going to see a lack of exciting new technologies coming out of Japanese companies, startups, academia. The funding is there, the engineers, the intelligence, the drive is there. But we do want what we can sit here and list the technologies that ended like Betamax and the ones that
Hmm.
ended like VHS, which are
Hmm.
both Japanese, by the way. So, what do you think? What do you see as kind of say the one critical thing to get more of these success cases?
You do not need to be involved in every single field. There's always going to be a new trend, whether it's carbon capture and storage,
Yeah,
or synthetic fuels, or solar cells in space, etc. There's always going to be new technologies. As a company, you'll have your core business, but you'll also be sort of investing in the future. That's great,
yeah,
but don't invest in everything. Invest in the
mm,
things that you really want to commit to. Later down the road, if you find that that's not the right path, sure, you can stop it. But I think at this moment, trying to stretch yourself thin across so many
yeah,
different directions is no longer possible on the kind
yeah,
of budgets that Japanese government has.
mm-hmm,
It's no longer a value creation for companies that
mm-hmm,
I think nowadays care much more about their shareholders and
absolutely,
about their sort of governance than simply the internal stakeholders. And so, stronger commitment to commercialization. If
mm,
we are going to make this technology work, we will create the demand side too, or we will work very
mm,
hard
mm.
to create the demand side. We won't just create the technology and say, well, everyone can see this, great, so please buy it. You know,
Yeah.
you'll go out there and you'll sell it.
Yeah.
If you as a company, if you know that you're not proficient at selling that technology or creating that market, then you'll ally with the companies that will.
Yep.
And ultimately, that's going to create better value for you as a company. It's going to create better value for Japan as a society, because there'll be less of that safety net, more of a risk reward.
Mm.
And, the ones that succeed will hopefully get rewarded.
Absolutely. Nice summary. Thank you, Yuri. Appreciate your time. Appreciate your insights. And no, thank you so much for taking the time to come on
Thank you,
board.
Andrew.
I know we could. There are plenty of different rabbit holes that we could dive into. Maybe let's jump into a couple of those over lunch. But thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you, Andrew. Appreciate it.
Nice.
Cheers.
Cheers, mate.